For weeks, rumors had circulated online, like smoke leaking from a fire no one could yet see. Whispers of a phone call, a confrontation, a truth that, once spoken aloud, could not be taken back. People said Justin had recordings. People said he was ready to expose everything. But no one, not even the most obsessive followers of the Whittaker story, expected what was actually captured in that now infamous call with Betty and Larry Whittaker. It didn't begin with shouting. It didn't begin with anger. It began with caution, Justin's voice steady, careful, almost painfully polite as he tried to navigate the minefield of confusion and emotional exhaustion surrounding the Whittaker home. What he revealed in that call wasn't just tension. It wasn't just drama. It was a revelation about the shifting alliances, hidden fears, and growing distrust inside the family itself. And yet, what made the call so shocking wasn't the words Justin spoke. It was what Betty and Larry revealed without realizing they were revealing it. People had long suspected that the Whittaker household was being pulled in multiple directions at once, each direction shaped by an outsider who claimed to know what was best. Some had accused Eric of manipulating them. Others accused Patrick. Others believed Betty and Larry were being misled by people pretending to be allies. But until that day, everything lived in the realm of speculation. Then Justin dialed their number. He wasn't calling to expose them. He wasn't trying to trap them. He was calling, as he had many times before, to try to understand what was happening and whether there was any truth to the stories swirling around them. But the moment Betty answered, the tone shifted. Her voice trembled like a porch screen in a storm, thin, stretched, tired in a way only someone carrying decades of responsibility could sound. She wasn't angry with Justin. She wasn't confused by him. She was weary, worn down, pulled at from every angle. Justin heard it immediately. He asked whether she was all right, whether Larry was nearby, whether the plans they had discussed, plans about housing, about safety, about finally getting the support they'd been promised, were still moving forward. And then came the moment that shook viewers weeks later when the audio finally surfaced. Betty hesitated. Not long, just long enough for anyone listening closely to feel the shift in the air. A pause full of implications. A pause that sounded like she was weighing whether she could speak freely or whether someone else might be listening. People who replayed the audio later said it was the first sign something was deeply wrong inside the Whittaker household long before the state intervened. Betty's hesitation didn't come from confusion. It came from fear. And even Larry, who had never been quick with words, seemed unusually guarded when he eventually joined the call. Justin tried to keep the conversation simple, straightforward. He asked about the permit for the electrical meter, the one necessary to bring a trailer onto the property, the one that would allow them to set up an alternative living space until more permanent housing could be secured. He reminded Larry that they had talked about it before. He explained the next steps. He laid out what needed to happen and how quickly it needed to be done. But again, the response was hesitant. Larry wasn't confused about the plan. He wasn't refusing. He wasn't dismissing Justin's request. But something in his voice, thin, uncertain, almost startled, betrayed a truth he didn't say out loud. The plan had been disrupted. Something had changed inside the house. Something neither he nor Betty had the strength to articulate. That moment became one of the most replayed segments in the leaked audio. People argued about what it meant. Some said Larry was under pressure from someone in the home. Others said he had been given conflicting instructions by another outsider. Others believed he didn't feel safe admitting the truth on the phone. But universally, listeners agreed. His voice carried the tone of a man suddenly unsure of who he was allowed to trust. Then the conversation took a sharper turn. When Justin brought up the rumors circulating about Eric, rumors Justin himself had tried to quash, Betty's answer didn't come immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft tight, bracing for fallout. She wasn't angry with Justin. She didn't accuse him of overstepping. But she didn't defend Eric either. And that silence said more than any argument could. Up until that point, most outsiders believed Betty still viewed Eric as a protector, someone who had helped the family, someone who had brought food, supplies, attention, and promises of a better life. She had thanked him publicly. She had defended him privately. She had allowed him into the home, something she didn't do lightly. But in that phone call, her tone shifted. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't resentment. It was something more complicated, the hesitant disappointment of someone realizing they may have trusted the wrong person. Justin sensed it immediately. He pressed gently, carefully, not accusing her of anything, but asking whether she had truly received what Eric had promised, whether the money donors had sent had reached her, whether the steps he swore were in motion had ever actually begun. And that's when Betty said the words that would later stun the internet once the call became public. "I'm not mad at you." 3 simple words, but they landed like thunder. She wasn't angry that Justin had confronted Eric. She wasn't upset that Justin had demanded the missing money be returned. She wasn't offended that someone outside the home had finally said what so many had been whispering. She wasn't protecting Eric anymore. The shift in loyalty, subtle, unintentional, honest, was unmistakable. But the most explosive moment came later in the call, when Justin warned Betty about someone he believed was influencing the home from within. A woman he suspected was acting on Eric's behalf. Someone who had inserted herself into the daily life of the family. Someone who, according to Justin, had arrived with suspicious timing. He didn't accuse her directly. He didn't demand Betty remove her. He simply urged caution. But Betty's response exposed a truth far more painful. She didn't have control over who came and went. She didn't have control over who offered help or what strings were tied to that help. She didn't even have the power to enforce boundaries inside the one place she had called home her entire life. The call revealed what the outside world had long feared. The Whittaker household wasn't just struggling financially or physically. It was being pulled apart by outside influences, whispered promises, and competing agendas from people claiming to be saviors. The call exposed something else, too. Betty and Larry were overwhelmed. Emotionally, logistically, mentally. They were drowning under the weight of caring for 3 severely disabled adults while being misled, manipulated, or pressured by people they barely understood. By the time Justin ended the call, he believed he had simply reassured them, guided them, encouraged them. He had no idea the internet would later replay his call like a forensic autopsy, dissecting every pause, every inflection, every sentence spoken and unspoken. When the recording leaked, the reaction was immediate and explosive, because the call didn't just suggest that Eric's promises were hollow. It suggested something far more dangerous. Betty and Larry were being influenced, controlled, and possibly monitored. And Justin was the only one who had dared to say it to their faces. The call wasn't just explosive. It was the first crack in a false narrative that had gone unquestioned for far too long. The call kept echoing in Betty's mind long after Justin hung up. The warmth in his voice, the steady reassurances, the subtle warnings woven between familiar concern. Every sentence lingered like smoke in a small room. For someone like Betty, who trusted slowly and loved deeply, the conversation had stirred something uneasy beneath her long-practiced politeness. But the real shift happened after the phone clicked off. Because for the first time in months, Larry asked a question he had never asked before. "Bet," he mumbled from his chair, "how'd Justin know all that?" It was a simple question, quiet, almost whispered. But in the Whittaker home, where doubts usually died unspoken. That question landed like a stone dropped into a still lake. Betty didn't answer right away. She pressed the phone to her chest, as though her body could shield the leftovers of the conversation. She had spoken to Justin dozens of times. He had promised a house, promised repairs, promised protection. But now there was something else in his tone, urgency, maybe pressure, something that felt like it wasn't meant for her benefit at all. She looked at Larry, whose faithful expression never hid anything. If he was uncertain, then something was wrong. Larry, she finally said, I don't know. But that wasn't entirely true. She didn't know. Or at least, she knew enough to realize Justin had information nobody should have unless they were watching the family more closely than he ever admitted. The conversation turned over and over in her mind as evening settled into the hollow and the house dimmed under its single working bulb. Little pieces of the call suddenly felt sharper. I think she's planted in your house for Eric. Be careful what she's trying to get you to do. We'll take you to Berkeley if we have to. Why would Justin say those things? Why would he think someone was planted in the home? Why was he already talking as if a move was guaranteed, not optional? And why did it sound like he had already decided their future? Betty sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall where paint had long turned to dust. She had lived through decades of hardship, storms, fires, sickness, and loss. But nothing crawled under her skin like the idea that people she barely knew were speaking about her life behind closed doors. She didn't like it. She didn't like any of it. Across town, Justin wasn't sleeping either. The audio he had collected, the call he asked someone to upload, was more than a message. It was a weapon, a shield, a strategic move in a fight he was losing control of. He paced across his living room, phone in hand, replaying pieces of the recording. Each line felt like a chess piece he had carefully positioned. He needed proof, he had told himself. Proof he was the one helping. Proof he, not Eric, had Betty's trust. Proof he was on the right side of the narrative, spiraling faster than he could manage. But there was another reason he wouldn't say out loud. Justin knew the storm was coming. The donation questions, the accusations, the private arguments with Eric that had begun as whispers and were now exploding into public suspicion. He needed something to clear his name, something to show he wasn't abandoning the family, even as everything around him fractured. The phone call was that something. The moment Betty agreed to let him share it, Justin felt a spark of relief, a way to defend himself, a way to steady the ground beneath him. Still, even he couldn't ignore the tremor running under the conversation. Betty sounded tired, confused, too willing to accept promises from men who stood miles away from the rotting porch she struggled to sweep each morning. 3 bedrooms, he repeated aloud. 24-hour care. Get you a house. The words felt different now. Heavy in his mouth, uncertain. Had he gone too far? Had he promised too much? He rubbed his forehead, the worry settling in behind his eyes. Justin wasn't the villain some people made him out to be, but he wasn't the hero either. He was something in between, lost in a web of loyalty, guilt, ambition, and the strange addictive pull of being needed. And the Whittakers needed someone. Anyone. He just wasn't sure anymore whether he was helping or hurting. The next morning, the audio reached the ears it wasn't meant for. Not Betty. Not Larry. Eric. He was sitting in his truck outside a gas station when the notification lit up his screen. New audio leaked. Justin calls Betty and Larry. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The title alone made his stomach clench, but when he pressed play, something inside him cracked wide open. He listened to Justin warning Betty about someone planted in her home. He heard the promise of a house, the implication of a conspiracy, the tone of intimacy in a relationship Justin was never supposed to have. What the hell? Eric muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't just betrayal. It was exposure. Justin wasn't only speaking to the family. He was maneuvering around Eric's influence, positioning himself as the new authority figure. And worse, he sounded believable. Eric shut off the truck engine and leaned back, jaw tight. His mind raced through every live stream, every message thread, every moment he had spent building trust with the Whittakers. Was Justin undoing all of it? Was he planting ideas in Betty's mind? Convincing Larry to break ties? This wasn't just about money or reputation. It was about control, over the narrative, over the truth, over who held the moral high ground. And Eric refused to lose. He opened his phone and recorded a voice note meant only for his closest circle. This is manipulation. He's spinning them. I'm telling you now, he's trying to replace me in that family. We're going to have to respond. The war between two men who claimed to love the same family had officially begun. Back at the Whittaker home, the ripple effects were beginning. Larry had been quiet all morning. He sat on the front steps, smoking a cigarette, staring at the gravel as if answers were hidden between the stones. "Bet," he said finally. Why'd he ask if he could share that call? Betty froze beside the sink. Larry wasn't the type to question people, especially not people he trusted. His confusion wasn't anger. It was fear, a subtle, creeping fear that they were being pulled into something they didn't understand, something bigger than them. "I don't know," Betty said softly, her voice thin. "Maybe he just wants folks to know he's helping." Larry shook his head. "Or maybe he wants people to know you're on his side." That was the moment the first seed of doubt truly took root. Because the truth was simple and painful. Betty didn't want sides. She wanted peace. She wanted her family safe. She wanted her life to stop feeling like a storm she couldn't outrun. But now, instead of food deliveries and promises of a new home, she found herself caught between two men battling for influence, each louder than the last, each more insistent that he knew what was best for her. She pressed her hand to her forehead as another wave of worry washed over her. She had lived through enough loss to know one thing for certain. When outsiders fight over a family like theirs, the family always ends up paying the price. Comment below, what do you think? The call that shook the household didn't fade the way most things did inside the Whittaker home. It lingered, echoing in the way Betty moved through the rooms, in a way Larry stood longer than usual on the porch, staring down the hollow road as though expecting someone to appear. Justin's voice, calm yet sharp with urgency, had carved a new awareness into both of them. For the first time in months, they were questioning not each other, but the people who claimed to be helping them. Betty kept replaying the sentences in her mind. "I think she's planted in your house for Eric." The words pressed into her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Gloria had seemed friendly enough, soft-spoken, neat, quick to sweep or fold towels when she saw a mess. But the idea that she might be reporting back to someone else forced Betty to review every small moment of the week. The questions Gloria asked about money, the way she lingered near the bedroom door when Betty thought she'd gone outside, the constant texting. Larry, meanwhile, tried to act as though none of it rattled him, but the truth sat under his skin like a splinter. He didn't trust easily, but when he did trust, he trusted too fast. He had believed Eric, believed Patrick, believed anyone who promised a straightforward solution. Now, here was Justin, someone who had asked for nothing, who had given him steps, not speeches, pointing out a presence in the house that suddenly made too much sense. The hours after the call were slow and thick. Betty washed dishes that were already clean. Larry paced the yard and mumbled to himself, trying to rearrange his thoughts into something that made sense. What neither of them said out loud was the part that stung most. They had been used before. This time just felt like it was happening in a quieter, more calculated way. Later that evening, after the sun slid behind the trees, Betty lowered herself into her chair and called Larry inside. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He knew from her tone that whatever she wanted to discuss wasn't going to be small. "Did you hear everything Justin said?" she asked slowly. "I heard," he answered, though his eyes drifted toward the door, as though expecting someone to be listening just outside. Betty leaned forward. "Do you believe him?" Larry swallowed the heaviness that sat at the back of his throat. "I don't know, but it didn't sound wrong." It was the closest he could come to admitting fear without naming it. Betty exhaled through her nose. "I've been feeling strange these past days, like someone's watching us here." She paused, not in a mean way, just watching, studying. Larry didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was agreement. Inside the house, Gloria moved lightly between rooms, organizing things that Betty hadn't asked her to touch. Every time she moved, the floor creaked softly, like a quiet warning. Betty watched her from the corner of her eye, trying to decide whether she should speak to her about the conversation or let the suspicion settle until she had proof. Proof, that was the part that always came too late in their lives. By the time they had it, the damage was usually done. Just after dark, Justin called back, not intrusive, not demanding, simply checking on them. This time, his voice sounded more anchored, more certain. Betty answered on speaker, letting Larry listen in. "How y'all holding up?" Justin asked. Betty offered a plain truth. "Feels like something's shifting." Justin didn't sugarcoat anything. Because it is. People are noticing inconsistencies. Money's unaccounted for. Promises were made that nobody followed through on. They're starting to look into everything. Larry stiffened. "Into us, too?" "No," Justin answered quickly. "Into them. Into the people who raised all that money in your name. Into the ones who used your faces and your struggles to make themselves look like heroes." Larry relaxed an inch, though his jaw stayed tense. Justin continued. "This call earlier about the permit, the meter, the trailer, that wasn't just a conversation. It was proof. Proof that y'all were being fed plans that never matched reality." Betty blinked. "You mean the house?" Justin didn't pause. "I mean everything around it. The paperwork, the money trail, the promises of caregiver. All of it. Nothing adds up. And now that people online are asking questions, the ones who started this whole mess are scrambling." Larry frowned deeper. "Why they tell us there was a trailer coming Tuesday then? Why they asked me for a permit if nothing was ready?" Justin's voice lowered as though he knew the answer but hated saying it. "Because they needed y'all to believe something was happening. They needed time. They needed you to stay quiet." Justin hesitated. Investigations. Media digging. Screenshots being shared. People comparing dates. The lies are starting to trip over each other. Betty leaned back into her chair, her heart pounding harder than she meant to let show. Larry whispered, "So it wasn't real." And Justin answered softly, "None of it was." The room fell still. Not silent, still. The kind of stillness that settles when a truth lands too heavy to push away. After the call ended, Betty sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. Her mind drifted through the last months. The visits, the gifts, the filming, the sudden bursts of generosity, followed by long periods of silence. The way certain people appeared only when there was something to record, something to post, something to update publicly. The way she and Larry had been thanked online more times than they had been helped in real life. It wasn't anger rising in her now. It was clarity. "When someone gives too much too fast," she murmured, mostly to herself, "it's usually not for free." Larry looked over at her. "What you saying, Betty?" She lifted her head, eyes tired but sharper than they had been in months. "I'm saying we need to be careful from now on. Real careful." Larry nodded slowly. "Reckon Justin was right? About that woman being planted here?" Betty hesitated, then said, "I reckon it ain't impossible." They didn't confront Gloria that night. They didn't make accusations. They simply became more aware, listening more, talking less, watching quietly the way people who have been misled too many times learn to do. The next morning came with a heavy fog. Gloria moved about the kitchen as though nothing unusual had happened, offering coffee, sweeping crumbs, humming under her breath. But Betty and Larry watched her differently now. Not unkindly, just warily, the way people watch someone whose intentions they're no longer sure of. Justin texted mid-morning, "Don't say anything yet. Just observe. Let me gather more." Betty showed the message to Larry silently. If the previous day had shaken them, this day began to harden them. They were learning that trust could no longer be given freely. It had to be earned slowly, carefully, deliberately. As the day stretched forward, Betty felt something shifting inside her. Not fear, not confusion, resolve. For the first time in months, she was beginning to realize that the people who really cared weren't the ones who filmed them, fed them on camera, or promised the world. They were the ones who asked for nothing and still showed up anyway. Something was unraveling, but something else was finally beginning. Comment below, what do you think? The morning after the shift in the house, the atmosphere felt different, not chaotic, not hostile, just watchful. The kind of quiet you get when everyone knows something is brewing under the surface, but nobody has said it out loud yet. Betty moved through her kitchen with steady purpose, her steps firmer than the day before. Larry stood by the doorway, glancing from window to window as though mapping out where the biggest cracks in their world had appeared. They didn't speak much over breakfast. They didn't need to. The silence carried understanding, a shared recognition that whatever was happening outside their home, on social media, in comment threads, in the corners of live streams, they needed to brace themselves for it. Justin's warnings still thrummed underneath everything they did. Someone might be planted in your house. The more they let that sink in, the more they realized how much had slipped past them while they were distracted by promises, live streams, and supposed help. Around noon, the sound of footsteps entered the kitchen, light, deliberate, a little too soft for someone who was simply walking. Gloria. She offered a smile, but it didn't meet her eyes the way smiles should. She set down a bag of groceries she claimed to have bought for them, but something about the gesture felt off now. Not wrong, just rehearsed. "Thought you might need more bread," she said casually. Betty thanked her, but her voice was cool, polite rather than warm. Larry didn't speak at all. He simply nodded stiffly and stepped away. If Gloria noticed a change, she didn't show it. She floated through the small kitchen, humming as she placed items in cabinets she'd memorized. But her eyes darted toward the table at odd moments, as if checking whether a phone was recording, as if waiting for something to slip out of someone's mouth. Betty watched her closely. That alone was a shift. Before Justin's call, she had given trust without reservation, assuming that anyone who came into the house arrived with kindness. Now, she was studying behavior, tone, timing, things she should have questioned sooner but hadn't known she needed to. Larry stepped outside, leaving the door open behind him. The yard outside was a patchwork of dirt and patchy grass, but the air felt cleaner than the inside of the tense kitchen. He exhaled hard, rubbing his head. Every thought felt tangled. All the promises he'd believed, all the people he'd let in. Now he wondered whether any of it had ever been real. After a minute, his phone buzzed. A message from Justin. "Stay steady today. Don't confront. Let the truth reveal itself. More coming." Larry stared at the words until they blurred slightly. He didn't know what more coming meant, didn't know whether to brace for help or disaster. But something inside him trusted Justin now more than he trusted the people who had made big, public declarations about saving the family. Meanwhile, inside the house, Betty walked past the living room and noticed that Gloria had set up her phone on the arm of the couch. Not recording, at least not visibly, but placed in a position that could catch conversations easily if someone walked by talking. That sight made Betty stop in her tracks. A cold awareness moved through her chest. She didn't react outwardly, didn't gasp, didn't confront, didn't ask questions. She simply filed it away in her mind. The day stretched on slowly. Mid-afternoon sun filtered through the broken blinds, casting pale lines across the old carpet. Betty and Larry avoided long conversations in front of Gloria. They answered short questions with shorter replies. They kept their thoughts close to their chests the way people do when learning they've been observed without consent. By early evening, Justin called again. Betty picked up quickly. Stepping out, Larry joined Betty on the porch, leaning in to hear the speaker. The air felt charged with anticipation. Justin continued, "People have been messaging me. People who've followed everything that happened the last few months. They're sending screenshots, timestamps, receipts. There are patterns." Betty closed her eyes briefly. "What kind of patterns?" "The same," Justin said. "Again and again. Money raised, then unaccounted for. Promises made publicly, nothing delivered privately. Messages that don't match timelines. People who were told one story, while you two were told another." Larry shook his head slowly. "So everything they said, everything they promised us." Justin didn't soften it. "It was a show, a long one." Betty's throat tightened. "And Gloria?" There was a pause on the line, short, but enough. Justin exhaled. "I can't prove it yet, but enough people recognized her username from the streams. She's been in Eric's comment sections for months, always defending him, always repeating his lines." Betty felt the porch tilt slightly beneath her feet. "So she's sent here?" "Possibly," Justin answered carefully. "Or she's just loyal to the wrong person. But either way, you need distance." Larry looked back at the door, imagining Gloria on the other side of it, tidying things that didn't need fixing. Justin wasn't finished. "You two deserve the truth. Not stories. Not content. Not strings attached to help." That sentence hit Betty so hard she had to sit down. Nobody had ever said those words to her before, not without expecting something in return. "Betty," Justin added, "the whole internet is watching this situation now. People are waking up. They're seeing what you two didn't because they weren't in the middle of it. You're not alone anymore." Larry rubbed his forehead. "Feels like we've been blind." "No," Justin corrected, his voice steady. "You trusted people who claimed they were helping. That's not blindness. That's humanity." Betty's eyes burned. Not from sadness, relief. Rare relief. Just then, the front door creaked. Gloria's head peeked out. "Everything okay out here?" she asked lightly. Betty tightened her grip on the phone. Justin's voice whispered through the speaker, too quiet for Gloria to hear. "Don't say anything. Not yet." Betty smiled politely. "Everything's fine," she answered, her voice steady in a way she hadn't felt in months. Gloria lingered, sensing something, but unable to pinpoint what it was. After a moment, she drifted back inside. The second she was gone, Justin spoke again. "She's listening now. She'll keep listening. Be careful." Larry let out a long breath. "What do we do?" "Nothing yet," Justin repeated. "But tomorrow, I'll send you something important. A link. Information. Proof. You'll understand everything then." Betty nodded, though Justin couldn't see it. "Okay, we'll wait." The call ended on a note that felt heavier than before. Not frightening, but definitive. A turning point. Something irreversible was unfolding now, tightening threads that had been loose for far too long. As night settled over the property, the tension didn't ease, but something else rose in its place: determination. Betty and Larry weren't passive observers anymore. They weren't letting other people shape their story. They weren't walking blindly into plans others made for them. They were watching. They were questioning. They were choosing who held access to their home. Inside, Gloria sat on the sofa with her phone in her lap, typing rapidly. She looked up when Betty entered the room and gave a small smile that no longer stirred trust. Betty smiled back, but something in her eyes had changed. The softness had been replaced with clarity, quiet, deliberate clarity. Larry took a seat across from Gloria, folding his arms. His presence was solid, unmovable. For the first time since she had arrived, Gloria looked the slightest bit unsettled. Something had shifted in the house, and everyone could feel it, even the person who had tried the hardest to pretend she was only helping. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the weight of the truth settled fully into the walls of the home. The promises, the lies, the manipulation, they were no longer hidden, no longer excusable. Tomorrow, everything would break open, and this time, Betty and Larry would be ready. Comment below, what do you think? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.